we're asking the question, could selling state assets fund government shortfalls? That is a question that Rory Ord, executive at RisCura, is going to tackle for us, and he joins us from our Cape Town studios. Rory, thank you for making the time to join us. Government assets, which one's on the radar? One that makes sense for selling, but two that are actually worth something.
Yeah, those are really the criteria that we applied. You know, which potential number of state assets could actually be sold to raise some much-needed capital for government. And out of the 130 or so disclosed entities that government owns, we came down to a shorter list of about 20, and then a much shorter list of 7 to look at in a bit more detail. And I think top of the list there would be Transnet as a possible sale for government to realize a substantial amount of capital.
When you say sell Transnet, who would buy Transnet, and is this a realistic proposition? I mean, ideologically, it just sounds not on.
Well, this is something that often comes up in the ideas of whether governments can sell infrastructure assets, and it's something that's an argument that's happened all over the world. And it's not quite common for private enterprises to actually hold these former state type of assets and infrastructure and transport assets. If you look right across the world, there's many examples of this kind of infrastructure being owned by private investors, and it doesn't seem to be such an issue anymore. It's certainly a viable alternative for government.
Rory, though, when one looks at the national broadcaster, which has happened to make it into your list, one would assume that there's just that patriotic symbolism that is associated with government owning its main media platform. Who would buy something like an SABC, even if there aren't questions about whether it's actually worth anything?
Well, I think the first question to ask with any of these enterprises is, do they have a viable business model outside of ownership by government? And with a potential sale of something like an SABC, you would have to ask whether TV license payments, for example, would continue, and would the business model actually be able to operate outside of the ownership by government. And this is something that has to be considered across all of these state-owned enterprises. If they were to be sold, then what would the framework be, and would the same rules still apply when they were in private hands? And if so, then it creates something viable for an outside party to buy.
Rory, you must have done some valuations here to work out how much money would be raised if they were sold. So if Transnet's top of the list, how much would the government get for it?
Yeah, well, our valuation team at RisCura did a lot of work on these assets, and Transnet, as you say, is top of the list. And we think in the region of 120 billion rands or so could be raised through a sale of Transnet. We don't believe this is the kind of asset that would be sold all in one go, and maybe not all of it would be sold if the government did decide to go down this path. But the components of Transnet, of which there are many, could be sold to infrastructure fund managers, pension funds and the like, who have a need for these type of long-term cash-yielding assets.
Rory, do you and your team have a sense of whether conversations leaning towards some of these suggestions are happening at all? Is there any possibility that there might be a critical review of what government does own, with the view of letting go of some assets that could really inject some funds to plug the deficit?
Well, if we look back even over the last 15 to 20 years, there's been intention from government all along that whole period of time to actually realize some state assets, to get rid of some future liabilities that they have, and to raise some capital. And we've seen through the recent sale of government's remaining stake in Vodacom, their 13.9% stake in Vodacom, that the government views this as a way to go. And we think that was probably just the first and the easiest one of the lot to sell. And that's why government started with the sale of that stake in Vodacom. But if we look back a little bit further even, the privatization of Telkom was quite a successful example of how it can be done in parts. That can be transitioned from being a state-owned enterprise over time to being a privately held enterprise. It can become more efficient and relieve government of some of the burdens of the ownership of these assets.
And of course it was done before with Sasol, it was done with Iscor, which became ArcelorMittal, so it is possible.